Alright, we have today another review. This is going to be a ride review on the 2011 BMW R1200GS Adventure. So the GS Adventure is a little bit different on some years versus others. So the 2011 specifically and older on the Adventure has a lower first gear than the other models. You'll notice a gap between first and second gear. I'd probably talk about this later, but the only time you really notice that, there's really three occasions, I guess. You know, sand, rocks, off-road. You'll notice it because you can get a little bit better start and a little bit more torque off the bottom. On a negative side, where you might see it is in really tight switchbacks on road. When you're having to make first and second gear changes, you'll notice that first gear is a little bit low and second gear is a little bit high. On the other bikes, first gear is a little bit higher, and therefore you don't really notice it, and it's just a smoother transition. Sort of the third thing is when you're trying to go up really steep climbs off-road, that first gear, having it really low like that, enables you to drive slower and more controlled. That's why I prefer the transmission that has the lower range. Also, some other changes that have happened over the years is the torque curve has gotten higher and higher and higher in the rev range. Start out with the 1100s, and the GS Adventure 1100s might be the easiest bikes to ride off-road because the torque is the lowest on those bikes, not lowest in the RPM range. So you have more torque right off the bottom. Once you go past 2013 on the GS Adventure, that torque curve is much higher. It's 1500 RPMs higher. I could be off, but about 1500 RPMs higher in the rev range. Going to the 1250, it's about 2000 RPMs higher, which is dramatic. So that off-road riding has to be at a higher speed or a higher RPM to have the same torque. And it's not real. I like it lower because it's just more controlled. Anyways, another difference between the GS Adventure versus the standard version is that you have a much larger tank. All of these shrouds here on the regular GS are just plastic shrouds. Here on the GS Adventure, it's a tank. You have over 8 gallons of fuel on this bike if you fill it all the way up. Surprisingly, these are very light motorcycles, even though they're heavy in bulk. You know, they're massive, but for what size this thing is, it looks like it should weigh as much as a Goldwing. Should be over 800, 900 pounds, but really they're just under 500 pounds without fuel. You add 8 gallons of fuel and it's a heavy bike. You add luggage, it gets even heavier. 2 people, even heavier. I ate 4 sandwiches, even heavier. Some other things that to note on this bike, I have actually changed out the seat. Seats on these are pretty comfortable when you first sit on them, but for longer rides they tend to be pretty uncomfortable just because they're squishy and you kind of get monkey butt. Another thing you get with the GS Adventures is this little foot peg extension, and you slide it over like that and in place. So when you're standing, that's a better position for your brake, and then you can just push it back in and put it back up for street use. We've gone over this bike in detail, skid plates, other additions to the bike that have been added, but we want to take it for a ride, so that's what we're going to do. There's going to be a lot of subjects here I'll probably start talking about and then have to just stop because I'll be like, oh yeah, I should cover that in a full adventure video. There's 3 bikes I'm going to do on the adventure series. Really there should be 4 because I should start with a 250, but we're going to go with the GS Adventure. We're going to go with a lighter weight, which is the KTM 690, and then we're going to do a more street-oriented bike, even more street-oriented than, say, a GS, which will be a Ducati Multistrada. So let's get started. First thing to sort of talk about is this is a massive motorcycle, right? If I look back here, I'm not sure you can see down here, but my knees are well within the range of the tank, so I'm protected from all sorts of weather, be that rain, hail, snow, all of that. I'm a bit more protected on this bike. Windscreen's a bit higher than the standard version, and so I'm protected pretty well by that. You'll see a couple of things on this bike. This is my mount for my GPS unit, which is a Trail Tech. I have that on every bike. You'll always hear me talk about that. On this bike, I also have a quad lock for my phone, because the Trail Tech doesn't do great street turn-by-turn navigation, but a phone always does the best. And then up here you'll see this antenna, and that antenna is for the Trail Tech, and there's a buddy system where you can see your buddies on the trail. So all the way up to like 3 miles back, I can see them. I'll know that they're still there, they're still moving, and I can continue on. They can look at the map and they can say, oh, look, he took a left-hand turn, or he took a right-hand turn. And I can see if they get off track too. Or when they stop, if they get a flat tire. All right. So first thing to sort of talk about is, how does this handle the weight in, say, a parking lot, and making U-turns and such? And, you know, it does really well. But these bikes can be intimidating, so you'll notice people take really, really wide turns with them, because they can be intimidating. They're heavy. They're big. It's a monster. The one thing about an adventure bike is that you're out for the adventure, so challenge is a big thing on an adventure bike. How much challenge do you want? And you always want some. In the parking lot, you don't want it to be a challenge. You just want to be able to park. And this has, I should probably have pointed out, it has knobby tires on it. So this is not street-oriented tires at all. It has knobbies. And I'm going to show you those really quick, because I think that's an important thing. You know, how do you choose tires? I'll probably have a whole segment on that, but I'm going to quickly put it. Here's how I choose my tires. I don't choose my tires for what percentage I'm going to ride the bike, on-road or off-road. These have knobby tires on it because I do take it on serious off-road adventures. Very serious. Single track, steep climbs, step-ups, huge descents. So I plan for the most extreme situation I can while still being street legal, and these are street legal tires. If I get into that situation with street tires, and I know maybe I'm going to ride 80% street, but in that 20% that I ride is really extreme off-road, I won't even be able to do it. So that's the way I choose my tires. The most extreme situation, because it's an adventure bike after all. I want to be ready for that adventure, even if I'm going to wear tires out. Anyways, parking lot, really easy. You got to get used to this, because you'll learn. We'll do a segment on this. Turning a big adventure bike like this, I'm leaning off the other side of the bike so I can make sharp turns. I'm not just leaning with the bike. I'm leaning the opposite direction so that the bike leans more and it turns sharper. You'll see it a lot more when you're on a big heavy bike like this. You see it a lot less on smaller bikes, because you can just kind of lean them and you don't feel intimidated. As far as power on these bikes, really smooth power delivery. They're relatively quiet. A lot of protection from the wind. And relatively quick. It's a 1200cc motor. One thing I'd talk about is like who's the, you know, what I guess we'll get into which bike is right for which rider. And you'll see a lot of people buy these R1200GSAs and other bikes, you know, the R1250, the you know, Super Tenere, there's a lot, so the Ducati Multistrada, there's a lot of them, the Africa Twin, and these are all the big bikes. And some will say that, hey, you know, they don't do as well off-road, and I'm here to tell you that they can all do as well as you have the skill to do it. So you kind of ask yourself a couple of questions. How much, I guess there's a few categories. Comfort, right? How far are you going to go and how comfortable you need to be? Range, how much fuel can you hold? How far can you go without stopping for fuel? Because a lot of these places you've got to either carry fuel or have a big enough tank. and how much challenge do you want in your adventure? So adventure is about challenge after all, not just seeing the sights. You can do that from a bus, a train, but you want some amount of challenge. And so for me, having a big adventure bike like this does add a bit more challenge to some of these really hard off-road sections, whereas a smaller bike like the 250, you don't have to worry about the challenge as much. So your skill level is going to matter. You know, how much skill do you have in handling a bike off-road? You know, if you don't have any, the lighter the bike, the better. You're just going to be happier. The challenge is just it's going to meet you anyways. You get to the point where if that's not a challenge anymore, and you're sort of like just looking for more and harder trails, what'll happen is you'll just end up doing shorter and shorter trails that are harder and harder. So that at that time, maybe you'll want to step up to a bike that's maybe a little bit more challenging, but offers some other things like comfort to get further, or two-up riding. So this bike in particular has an excellent ability to carry 2 passengers very comfortably. It has enough room on the bike to where the driver is completely comfortable. They have their own space. The passenger is completely comfortable with their own space. They've got their own handles. They're on their own seat, completely separate from yours. They can hold on if they want to you or to the motorcycle itself. On a smaller bike, let's say a 250 or the 690, they're really a single person bike with extra pegs. So you're sitting right on top of each other. Not very comfortable for very long. The next thing is sort of range. You have a lot of range, over 300 miles of range with this particular bike. With like the 690 by itself, you're well under 200 miles range, which is not, for particularly in our case, where our adventures, that's not far enough. You won't be able to make it to the next gas stop. So we have to carry extra fuel on that bike, either by an extra tank internal or a Rotopax. On the 250s, the external tanks are more readily available. They get excellent fuel economy, so you can really make that 220 mile range with a aftermarket fuel tank. Sometimes even with the fuel tank they come with. So let's get back to this bike. Big enough, heavy enough that comfort, which is one of the things we were talking about, in heavy winds, it's a very comfortable bike to ride. It doesn't get blown around as much. It doesn't buzz, like, you know, there's very little vibration. I'd say it's as comfortable ride as, very close to a Goldwing. Now this one's gonna have a little bit more vibration because I'm running knobby tires, but if I ran knobby tires on a Goldwing, it would be just as buzzy. So it's just my preference to run those tires, and they do really well on road as they do off-road, which is surprising. You know, they're not it's not a racetrack bike, but you see people do things on these GSs that may surprise you. You know, keeping up with sport bikes in corners. They've got extra suspension. It's soft. You can go through corners with a lot of confidence because the bumps don't upset the corner at all. They steer really well. They're super confidence-inspiring bike. The tail-lever front suspension really helps with that. We can get into some of the suspension. We've changed out the suspension on this bike. This had the ESA suspension on it, and the electronic suspension adjustment, it gives you very little adjustment choices in your suspension, and my philosophy has always been it's soft, too soft, and way too soft. There's just not enough for the off-road that we do as far as adjustments to work with the ESA. So we've stripped that off and put on aftermarket suspension that's a lot more capable, and you can make it very stiff. But we've got it in a setting where it's set it and forget it. It works really well on the road and it works really well off-road. It doesn't bottom out like the old suspension did. You can take jumps. You can take it over whoops. It does really well. Where the stock suspension really had some issues. So that is a concern. If you really get into some heavy off-road situations with the GS, you may end up having to work on that suspension a little bit. They still work pretty good though. I've taken stock ones on some pretty heavy off-road stuff. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of ergonomic things with this motorcycle. So the GSA comes with an adjustable windscreen, and it really just adjusts this windscreen back or forward, and it's pretty much unnecessary because really on these bikes you want this windscreen up as forward as possible so that it blocks that wind and creates the turbulence behind you, not right at you. So you don't want the windscreen face towards you. Once you're standing up, you're looking right over it. Bars are a bit adjustable. A lot of people are putting bar risers on these. I find this one to be about perfect. I'm 6 foot tall, seems to be great. Mirrors, I love the mirrors. They're out far enough where they're beyond my shoulder and I can see behind me really well. I'm not looking directly at my shoulders. These do really well. Handguards are plastic. They're gonna do okay for going through brush and stuff. In a fall on rocks, those are going to break. So getting better handguards, if you're going to say plan on falling, if you're going to put yourself in a situation where you're likely to fall, get some better handguards. Let's see what else. I've done some adjustments to the pads and stuff on this bike just to have a better, so I can grab the bike with my knee. I don't know if you can see those, but something I've done. Bikes are great, have lots of power, do wheelies real easily, and handle really well. So this is a really smooth uphill, plenty of power up the hill, obviously. I'd say obviously because it's 1200. Handles really well. Now keep in mind we're on knobby tires. But the bike really does handle well. Bring the bike all the way over just to the side of the tires there. Does just fine. You can drag your toes in the corners, no problem. And it's super stable. The bike's not wanting to go any odd directions with the bumps, anything like that. It doesn't twitch. Transition side to side really nicely. And we're at the top. That was an odd stretch looking at that bicycle that's back there. Transmissions on these are really nice. They shifts into gears really well. Sometimes you can't even hear it shift into gears. There's no clunking. Clutch is really light. These have a dry clutch. Handling is superb. it just seems, you know, through these corners you're just dragging a toe and still you can let go with one hand. That's how confidence inspiring these bikes are. I really enjoy driving the 1200. Put it up in 6th gear, and you can just cruise all day on this bike, and really literally cruise for 1,000 miles with no issues. This is the BMW R1200GS Adventure. Boom.